Elizabeth, thank you so much, and thank you to your team who have also been working really hard tonight to make tonight possible. And thank you all for coming. My name is Katrina Murray, and I am the Executive Director of Young Professionals in Foreign Policy Brussels. We're here tonight because we're all interested in foreign policy. YPFP aims to translate this interest into tangible resources for your professional lives. Tonight, we are going to talk about the key challenges and opportunities for the transatlantic relationship. How we're going to do that tonight, we're going to have an introduction, some key remarks from the Ambassador, and then, as we said, over to question and answers from yourselves. But first of all, I'd like to introduce the Ambassador, Anthony Gardner. Ambassador Gardner is an expert on the transatlantic relationship, having dedicated 20 years as a government official, lawyer, and investor. Most recently, he was Managing Director of Parliament Capital Partners, a private equity firm, and was Executive Director in the Bank of America and GE Capital. Ambassador Gardner has also worked as a senior lawyer in firms in London, New York, Paris, and Brussels. He has served as Director for European Affairs on the National Security Competition, and I understand you also completed an internship with the European Commission in DG Competition, which is fantastic. He's also the author of A New Era in USEU Relations, the Clinton Administration, and the New Transatlantic Agenda. Ambassador Gardner is joining us tonight to discuss the economic and political priorities of the EU-US relationship. And it's a critical time for that relationship. The EU and the US are currently negotiating an ambitious transatlantic trade and investment partnership agreement, also known as TTIP. At the same time, both partners are actively engaging abroad with significant threats to the global security order, be it Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, or beyond. Tonight, I'm also really thrilled to announce the launch of YPFP's new Economic Diplomacy series in this joint event with the US mission. Given Ambassador Gardner's extensive experience in the international financial sector, we couldn't think of a better person to launch this series with. But why economic diplomacy? In an interconnected global age, our prosperity is more and more linked with that of the global economy. Economic diplomacy, literally defined, is the use of international diplomatic assets to advance the economic prosperity of a particular country or group of countries. The key aims of economic diplomacy is to promote trade, investment, growth, jobs, and to support domestic industries. And to major economies like the EU and US, built on strong traditions of open trade, mutual flows of investment, and dynamic private sectors, economic diplomacy is key. Next year, we'll be organising a series of events on the important nexus between foreign policy and the economic outlook for the next decade. And we really welcome your feedback about what you'd like to hear about in our new Economic Diplomacy series. After the event, we'll have some more time to discuss the pressing issues for 21st century transatlanticism over a reception generously hosted by the US mission. So without further ado, please allow me to pass the floor to Ambassador Gardner. Ambassador, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I understand that in addition to everyone in the audience here, we have people joining us from London and the United States. So this is very virtual, very high tech. I look forward to a discussion afterwards, so I'll try to be relatively brief. Before getting into my remarks, I just wanted to check whether or how many of you are working at the Commission or EU institutions. There are a few of you. And in business here in Brussels? There are also a number of you, all right. NGOs as well. So this is a good mix. All right, excellent. Well, it wasn't so long ago, it doesn't feel like so long ago, that I was starting my career here in Brussels. I landed in 1990, and I had an interest in EU issues, which started at my graduate work in Oxford and then at American Law School. And it was thanks to one of my favorite professors that I landed as a stagiaire in then DG4, known as DG Competition, in 1990. And it was a wonderful experience for me. I was in DG4 writing papers on how the US Supreme Court would analyze particular issues of interest to DG Competition. And that led me in turn to stay on as a lawyer in a U.S. law firm, an international law firm in Brussels, where I practiced EU antitrust law and EU anti-dumping law. And part of the reason maybe I had such a good time is that when I landed in 1990, I had to find a place to stay. And I was wandering around, and I went to the Place du Grand Sablon, and there was a sign on the door outside Vitamer saying Alloué. And I walked in and I met Madame Vitamer, and she looked at me and she says, "You must rent the apartment on the 3rd floor." And I said, "Well, I'd like to take a look at it." And I did. It was a wonderful apartment. I understand actually it's no longer for rent, sorry. So those of you who may be interested. And I looked at it, I fell in love with it, and I was renting there for a number of years. And I say it was a wonderful experience because I would come back from work, and every day I would see a platter outside my door with chocolates and pastries and a little note from Madame Vitamer saying, "I hope you don't mind." I said, "No, I don't mind. In fact, I'd like to have a bit more, please." And that was a very sweet beginning for me, and that led to a number of other things. After 3 years of practicing law here, I was able to work, as mentioned, at the White House in Clinton's first term. And I arrived at the White House in October 1994, and I said, I want to focus on EU-related issues. This was in the European Directorate. And the answer I got back then is absolutely true. The answer I got back then in October 1994 was, "That's great, because no one else in this building cares about that stuff." Honestly. One of the first calls I made when I arrived was to the Office of the Secretary of the Treasury. And the question I asked was, what is our policy on the single currency? And the answer I got was, well, we don't need to have a policy because it will never happen. Imagine that, 1994, 5 years later, guess what? It happened. Now, no one would say today, obviously, in the White House, we don't care about that stuff. So much has happened in 20 years. Back then, the number of people, frankly, in the U.S. government focused on European community issues was pretty small. Today, it is perhaps not vast, but there's certainly quite a few people who are following what the European Union is doing, and it's for a very good reason. Not only is the EU now impacting what we are doing in economic policy and competition policy, but it's impacting a lot of areas. We're working together with the EU on politics, on security, on development assistance, and a whole range of areas. Let me just cite one example of how our relationship with the EU has evolved dramatically. We have 170 people working at the U.S. mission to the EU, and this actually struck me as I arrived, because I wasn't fully aware. Only half of the 170 come from the State Department. The others come from basically the entire U.S. government. Department of Commerce, Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, everybody is represented. Why? Because again, almost everything the EU does touches on fundamental interests of the United States, and that's what makes this job, frankly, so interesting. Now, from the very beginning, the U.S. relationship with the EU has recognized the intertwined nature of economics and security. Now, in 1953, one of my predecessors, the U.S. appointed David Bruce as the first, actually, of my predecessors, both as a U.S. observer to the Interim Committee of the EDC, the European Defense Community, and as a U.S. representative to the ECSC, the European Coal and Steel Community. And the United States understood, as European countries did, that economic integration could set Europe on the course for peace, rebuilding after the terrible war. At the same time, former foes to the east were coming together under a slightly different embrace, the Soviet embrace, and there's no denying that the U.S. support for the nascent EU and even policies such as the Marshall Plan were intended to stem the influence of the Soviet Union. So the politics and the economics of the transatlantic relationship have always been very closely linked. So with that reminder of not so distant past, I just want to talk about two priorities. There are many things on our in-tray, but two priorities for us as a mission. And the first is the current situation in the Ukraine, and the other is the ongoing negotiations for Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement, the TTIP. Now, there are many other areas which are keeping us busy. That won't be any surprise to you. Climate change is increasingly important, particularly in the second term of the Obama administration. ISIL, foreign fighters, cybersecurity, the list is pretty extensive. But let me just talk about those two. Let me start with Ukraine. Back when I was at the White House, I worked on concluding the new transatlantic agenda, which we finally got signed in December 1995. I remember it was one of my last days at the White House. We signed it in Madrid. It was Felipe Gonzalez was there as the Spanish Prime Minister, and Clinton was there, and the EU as well. And one of the things we tried to do in the new transatlantic agenda was to reinforce our cooperation to consolidate democracy and stability in Russia, Ukraine, and the other independent states, and to strengthen their democratic institutions as part of the text that was released in 1995. And we noted, I'm quoting, an enduring and stable security framework for Europe must include these nations. Now, unfortunately, while Europe and the United States have remained steadfast in our resolve, we have not always had a willing partner in Russia, despite the so-called reset. Today we continue to face a serious crisis in Ukraine. And it's worth reminding ourselves that the crisis started with Russia's refusal, which continues to this day, to allow the Ukrainian people to choose their own future, to make a fundamental choice. And the choice of their own destiny includes whether to sign a free trade agreement with the EU. The U.S. and the EU are standing up for the principles of territorial sovereignty and against the use of force. Russia's actions invading sovereign Ukrainian territory in the Crimea and claiming that it's now part of Russia represent a fundamental challenge to our shared values and the rules-based international order, and they require a steadfast response and the willingness, the ability to incur and to bear the costs. Now, sometimes a picture can be worth 1,000 words. I don't know whether do we have the ability to, there we go. That's my cartoon. I have it on the wall behind my desk. I look at it every day. That's a picture of the future that may be. It's not necessarily what is today, but for those of you who can't quite see it, we have Vladimir Putin as Cupid, unwitting Cupid, but he's Cupid. He's wearing his military fatigues. He's macho, bare-chested, and he's just fired an arrow. U.S. and EU are the words carved into the trunk of the tree, and in the distance, there are two figures, obviously the United States and the EU are walking hand in hand. Now, is that going to be the future? Now, perhaps it's worth explaining why I'm putting this cartoon up on the wall. This comes from The Economist, an article that was published in late March, with an accompanying article called Putin's Arrow, the Crisis in Ukraine is Reinvigorating Transatlantic Ties. And as The Economist article argued, Russia is reminding us of the ties that bind. Russia obviously supplied troops and equipment to the separatists in Ukraine, bears responsibility for the slaughter of European citizens over the skies of Ukraine. Russian military forces are still there in significant numbers, and the Russia-Ukrainian border is still unsecured. And since the ceasefire was announced on September 5, attacks continue on Ukrainian positions, and significant Ukrainian forces and civilians have been killed, and the illegal occupation of Crimea continues. The EU and Ukraine made an important concession to stated Russian concerns by agreeing not to implement the tariff provisions in the Free Trade Pact until January 2016. But now Russia threatens to retaliate in the event that Kiev implements any part of that agreement, including those related to reforms and modernization. And most recently, we saw a member of the European Parliament turn back at Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow. Why? Because she voted in favor of sanctions. Now, Putin continues to enjoy unrivaled popularity at home, 85%, perhaps north of that. No surprise to me. I've spent a lot of time in Russia, and there's nothing like banging the nationalist drum. But it's safe to say that Russia has set back Russia's strategic interests, I think, in many areas. For example, Russia's actions, including the shutoff of gas to the Ukraine, have focused minds on Russia's unreliability as an energy exporter and the importance of an EU energy policy, much discussed going back many, many years. But today, finally, perhaps something will be done about it. And you see in the new commission, there is now a commissioner for energy union. Also, countries are now refocusing their minds on the need for higher defense spending. Again, talked about for many years, but we're seeing some countries actually increasing the defense spending. and it's accelerated the projects of many countries to join the European family, either the EU or association agreements. And it is certainly, what's happened in Ukraine has certainly alienated the vast majority of Ukrainians. And this did not need to happen. It did not need to happen. Ukraine has indeed long historic cultural ties with Russia, and it certainly didn't need to happen for the vast majority of Ukrainians to now consider Russia an enemy. Throughout the Ukrainian crisis, the transatlantic relationship has remained very solid and resilient. The U.S. government and the Commission, Council, and member states are coordinating financial assistance bilaterally and through the international financial institutions, focusing aid programs where they're most needed and working together to help Ukraine to begin to address its energy needs. So our coordination on sanctions have been close and productive. And again, that's rather surprising to me. I thought, how difficult is it for the EU to coordinate among 28 member states whose histories, vulnerabilities to Russia are very varied. And despite those differences between those 28, the EU has managed to act quickly and effectively. Russia's aggressive actions should remind us again of the geostrategic and economic importance and the possibilities of TTIP, the second issue I wanted to touch on briefly. And as you're aware, we launched these negotiations a little over a year ago. The seventh round just concluded outside of Washington, and we're looking forward to continuing this project with the new Commissioner, Cecilia Malmström. Now, this is a big job, and part of the job that we have together is one of messaging. And on the topic of messaging, I noted President Juncker's instructions to the Commissioner not to conclude a deal, and I'm quoting, which threatens Europe's safety, health, social, and data protection standards, nor jeopardizes Europe's cultural diversity. Now, we don't believe that there's a risk of that occurring. The US and EU both take these protections seriously, and TTIP builds on our shared commitment to a strong regulation in the public interest. We believe the case for TTIP is positive, not a double negative. But that instruction actually reveals quite a bit, because the debate in Europe now is very much defensive. What can we lose? I believe in a Europe that can win. One thing I wasn't mentioned in the introduction, I also happen to be European. My mother's Italian. I actually have also European citizenship, rather unusually for an American ambassador. I believe in a Europe that can win. I think there's a positive case here for TTIP, and we need to make it. You need to make it. Businesses need to make it. And to hear this defensive case is, well, it's upsetting. TTIP is not just about big business. This is about big business. It's another message I keep on saying. This is about, if anything, particularly about small and medium-sized enterprises, who are the backbone of our economies. It's about providing consumers with more choice, better quality products, at lower cost. It's about growth and jobs, growth and jobs. I keep on repeating it, but you know what's so fascinating to me? When I go around talking about TTIP, there are people outside the door with big signs about chlorinated chicken. And there are people outside the door talking about investor-state dispute settlement and a lot of other things. But nobody's outside the door with a sign saying, we want more jobs. Now, why is that? Why is it in a Europe that has 11% unemployment, double that in some countries, with youth unemployment actually significantly in excess of those numbers, in some countries 40%. Why is it that no one is standing outside the door saying, we want growth and jobs? It's a bit of a puzzle. We need this growth and we need these jobs to provide work, not only to provide work for the unemployed, but to fund pensions for our retirees and to pay for the health, the safety, the environmental protections our citizens expect. Now, you can explain that much of what we're trying to achieve, and I keep on hammering this point, is actually a natural extension of what Europe has already achieved in its single market. And the single market, as we know, eliminated tariff walls and allowed goods and services to circulate freely. And I say, what's so terrible about that? No one's criticizing the single market. Everybody has benefited. What we're trying to do is taking some of the single market and extend it geographically. And Europe should embrace it. Now, although Europe is certainly an ambitious undertaking, especially due to its focus on non-tariff barriers, Both sides have negotiated many free trade agreements in the past, and we know from our own experience, from actual data and statistics, for example, relating to NAFTA, our North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, that these free trade agreements have stimulated exports, high-paying jobs, and consumer benefits. And I also argue that an agreement between two advanced economies that share the same values and high standards should be more attractive than an agreement between economies at different stages of development that do not share the same values and standards. Negotiators on both sides are attempting to deliver a comprehensive and ambitious agreement that eliminates tariffs and reduces behind-the-border non-tariff barriers. And if we're successful, TTIP will create growth and jobs and provide greater choice and lower costs for consumers. Another puzzle. When I go around speaking, there are often people who say, you know what, we don't believe the Commission's projections about the growth that will result from this deal. And we think it's going to take a much longer time. You know, maybe they're right, but maybe they're wrong. But I can tell you that every serious academic study on both sides of the Atlantic agree that this deal is the best debt-free stimulus available, and it will create growth and jobs. Now, how is it that suddenly we've become so accustomed to, I don't know, we're so used to throwing away possible benefits and saying, well, that's not good enough. You know, 100,000 or 500,000 or 1 million jobs is not good enough. We should take every opportunity available to stimulate growth and jobs, and this is one of them, again, without increasing debt. Now, more than anyone else, young people stand to benefit from this deal. They're the ones who are disproportionately represented among the unemployed. While the U.S. economy is growing at 4.6% and our unemployment rate has declined to 5.9%, we're not satisfied. Part of the reason, to be blunt, part of the reason our unemployment is reduced to 5.9% is a lot of people stopped looking for work. Now, we've had a tremendous benefit from the shale gas boom and our oil boom, which has resulted in a favorable employment situation, but we want more. We want this deal too, and Europe should as well. Now, the successful conclusion of TTIP would also be of tremendous geostrategic importance, a point that I think is underappreciated, and I talk about it as much as I can. What do I mean by that? It means that TTIP would set a standard for future regional and global trade deals that reflect the values we place on rules-based trade, high standards, and regulatory transparency and accountability. It would help the USEU global partnership in the realm of trade negotiations, helping to make progress in stalled WTO trade talks, and ensuring that world trade rules will continue to be compatible with free market democratic systems. And we have a window. Who knows how long that window will be open? 10 years, maybe less, to conclude this deal before other countries whose weight in the world economic system is only growing, before they set the rules and not us. And if we fail, I think those countries will seize the opportunity to set a very different kind of trading arrangement. The debate in Europe and the United States on TTIP should be focused on how we can achieve a comprehensive agreement that extends benefits to citizens and businesses on both sides of the Atlantic. We cannot succumb to misinformation and scaremongering, and there's quite a bit of that. For example, investor-state dispute settlement is a real puzzle to me. I was a lawyer for a long time. I was actually also in international commercial arbitration. I actually knew what ISDS was before it suddenly became a household name. And suddenly it's been seized. This issue has been seized by those who want to destroy the agreement before it ever has a chance of taking off, and it's mischaracterized. It's mischaracterized as a way to undermine the sovereign right to regulate, but it isn't that. What the critics often don't mention is that it has a very high standard for an investor to sue. The standard is expropriation or fundamental denial of due process. Of course, anybody can bring a lawsuit. You can bring any kind of lawsuit, even in national court. Doesn't mean you're going to win. And I can tell you that all the cases that are cited, they're usually 4 or 5. Philip Morris is one of them. The Lone Pine Resources in Quebec is usually another one. Vattenfall in Germany is a third one. No one mentioned those are cases that are filed. It doesn't mean they're going to win. And I can tell you that a change in regulation is typically not sufficient to win a case. You can't say my expectation of profit when I invested has been interfered with because the government changed the regulation. You typically have to show that there was an agreement between the investor and the state, and the state broke that agreement, therefore the investor has a right to sue. So most of the criticisms are mischaracterizations. To conclude, so in my journey from early career to my position as U.S. Ambassador to the EU, I've seen the relationship broaden and deepen significantly. Now, there are points where we differ. However, our shared values are real. We have a shared belief that our nations are better off when we are both strong and prosperous, and when we're actively engaged together in a more dangerous and less predictable world we live in. So we need a robust global partnership, and I'm looking forward to playing a small role in that development. Now, you have a role to play as the new generation. You represent the new generation of leaders in this transatlantic relationship, and your views and experiences are molded less by the Cold War and more by the growing role the EU will play in this new world. The United States and the EU must live up to the commitment we made in the new transatlantic agenda 20 years ago to support Ukraine and other fledgling democracies in the European neighborhood and beyond. Keeping the transatlantic relationship relevant and engaged in the world requires new voices to be heard and young people to take an interest and to take a stand. As citizens of the EU, the United States or elsewhere, as well as in your professional capacities, it is up to you to keep that relationship flourishing. It's up to you to continue to find the ways to bring Europe and the United States closer together through our economic and political ties, as well as through informal exchanges with your counterparts across the Atlantic, like the one we're enjoying here tonight. Now, I can't stress enough the importance of organizations like this one in helping to build the expertise of young professionals and to build the transatlantic relationship. The U.S. government and EU institutions can only do so much. The heart of the transatlantic relationship lies in our people and our shared values, our shared history, and our shared aspirations. So with that, let me just go back and remind you that when people tell you, as they told me, no one cares about that stuff, you should push back, because sometimes things tend to evolve. Certainly our relationship with the EU evolved significantly over 20 years. If you have an interest for a subject, a certain field, as I did when I embarked on my new career, you should hold fast, you should remain committed, and stay close and loyal to your ideals. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I'm going to take the privilege of being the moderator to ask the first question, because it's come in from Twitter. And it's something I've been reflecting on. I've actually just come back from a trip to Bulgaria. I was in Sofia, and I was actually at a dinner with the foreign minister and a few regional representatives of the Sofia Council. And they're very pro-TTIP, but they're finding it hard to tell their people why TTIP is good, why it's a good idea, and to make that message understood. So I'd ask you, Ambassador, and this is a question from @JohnBillow, so thank you, John. What do you see as the biggest and single mutually beneficial element of TTIP for the EU and the US, across the EU? So a big question too.
Thanks. Well, I tried to touch on that, but let me try to recap. The first clearly is growth and jobs. That's the soundbite. It's not the only silver bullet. There are lots of other things the EU can do and is doing. Completion of the single market, particularly in digital. Undertaking important structural reforms of its labor market. And a lot of other things we can mention. But certainly, we think that free trade among the two largest trading blocs, certainly one that's very ambitious, if we succeed in eliminating non-tariff barriers, or reducing, I should say, non-tariff barriers to make it easier for small and medium-sized enterprises to trade across the Atlantic, that will certainly stimulate growth and jobs that Europe, as we all know, desperately needs both growth and jobs. So that's the soundbite. However, I would also suggest that, and as also mentioned, we have to remember this geostrategic context in which we're negotiating this deal. It is actually very significant. These are not just words. Now, it is perhaps easy to think when we talk about values, well, these are just soft terms, but they matter. Just think about the world we're living in. Just think about the people whose throats are being slit in the Middle East, innocent people. Just think of what's happened in Russia, or the refugees from Iraq or from Syria, or what's happened in many parts of Africa, and the fact that many of the countries emerging from totalitarian or authoritarian regimes in that part of the world and haven't yet made a transition to democracy. Just think of how people there are suffering. This partnership between the U.S. and the EU is real, and this trade agreement actually is much more than just about trade. It's about reaffirming what we stand for and setting standards and rules together before others do it, as I mentioned. That's how I would summarize it.
Thank you so much. We'll now take questions from the floor. I will ask you to introduce your name and which organization you're from. And I can see a question from the lady in the back up there.
I'm not sure, yeah, it's working. As you mentioned, comprehensive trade agreements bring about more cooperation, economic growth, and hence stability and common security. At the moment, culture is one of the few exceptions, explicit exceptions. There are other exceptions or other things that are not on the table yet, such as defense procurement and other important issues. As you also mentioned, here in Europe, there are lots of voices that try to water down the agreement with, you mentioned most of the arguments for it. So where do you think this is going? Will we be able to find a comprehensive agreement? Will we be able to reach the common security in the future? Where are the negotiations leading?
Well, it's a good point. As I often mention when I talk about this, we need to remember we're at an early stage of these negotiations. Just think of how long it took CETA, the Canada-EU trade agreement, which has now been finalized, is going through legal scrub, as they call it. It's almost done. So we've just had our 1-year anniversary. So these are early days, 7 rounds. So that's the first point. The second point is we are making progress. Unfortunately, a lot of the progress we're making is not particularly sexy. We'll put it that way. I mean, this is technical work where we're clearing out some of the underbrush. Right, we're exchanging information about our respective systems. We're gaining a better understanding of each other's systems, which is important. It's laying a groundwork for future progress. And in addition to that, we have exchanged offers both on tariffs and on services. We have 5 consolidated texts, meaning bracketed texts that U.S. and EU positions, showing where we differ, but it's consolidated texts in 5 areas. So we are making progress. Now, it won't be surprising for you, no doubt, to say that in the non-tariff areas, progress is slower, because this is the really difficult stuff. And there are various avenues ahead. Having common standards is the most difficult because we have different systems in the U.S. and the EU. Mutual recognition is also not easy, but there are also other ways of getting to the result of reducing red tape and costs. And that is to basically, where our regulations are different, to say, well, we arrived at the same result. We recognize them as being equivalent, or providing equivalent protection. And even when we can't do that because our regulations are fundamentally different, what we still can do is to say, well, do we really need to test twice on either side of the Atlantic, and thereby increasing costs for manufacturers? Do we need to test twice? In the case of pharmaceuticals, for example, and it's a very actual case where the FDA, our Food and Drug Administration, and the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, are working together to have a common file for the submissions by pharmaceutical companies who want approval of their new drugs. And you can think, well, that's very technical, it's not particularly exciting, but actually having separate files and separate requirements on manufacturers who want drug approvals is extremely expensive. So there are lots of ways that we can work together to achieve the objective of reducing costs and getting rid of unnecessary barriers. And I say unnecessary because they don't actually improve the health and safety of consumers on either side of the Atlantic. Again, we're not seeking to deregulate or to go to the lowest set of regulation. Actually, that's completely false. What we're trying to do is attack those regulations that don't improve health and safety. We've made some progress in cars, both on crash safety and on emission standards for light trucks. I mentioned pharmaceuticals, chemicals is another area. There are a few other areas beyond that in terms of sectors where we're focusing on. In addition to that, we're looking at what we call cross-cutting principles of good regulation. So looking forward to future regulations. How do the US and the EU try to arrive at a similar place by ensuring that there is an ability in an early stage of the process for people to comment? We have a particular system we call the notice and comment period. Now, we're not saying to the EU, you need to adopt our system, but we're saying to the EU, and by the way, this view is shared by a lot of EU businesses, particularly small and medium-sized companies, and a lot of member states who share our belief that the EU's regulatory system could improve their transparency, their accountability, and ability for people to participate at an early stage. So, if I had to summarize, we're making good progress, we're at an early stage, and what we need to do right now, I'm absolutely convinced, we need to keep the level of positive energy high enough before the critics kill this thing in the egg. And there's a real danger of that. I just see this in a social media environment spiraling out of control in some member states, not in all member states to be fair, but in some member states the critics have latched on to a few myths, and they're not being rebutted sufficiently aggressively. So that's part of what we're trying to do here at the mission.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to take a question from Twitter now. Also, I'll need to repeat the questions asked tonight so that those on our webcast can hear. So I'll ask you to keep your questions short and sweet so I don't paraphrase anyone. So we have from Twitter @Hamza_Seri, who asks, why is the US so reluctant to put financial services on the table?
This is a question that is often asked. It's only partly correct to say that we don't want to put financial services on the table. We do want to put financial market access issues on the table very much. It's a very big issue for both of us. The US and the EU have very competitive financial services industry. So market access, in terms of what we mean by market access, is the ability to provide financial services, right, and get licensed in each other's countries. That very much is part of the debate. What we don't want to see as part of this agreement is a financial regulatory cooperation piece that the EU is eager to see part of the agreement. And the answer for that is several-fold. The first is that we feel that these issues are already being discussed in terms of financial regulation in other places, in other fora. The G20 and also the financial markets regulatory dialogue that we have on a bilateral basis, the US and the EU. We meet regularly with our experts to talk about areas of risk where our regulation are or may be divergent and hence will impose a cost on our companies. And we think that that dialogue is working. And then actually, and we call upon the EU and our interlocutors here to point out where there is this real risk of us becoming unstuck from each other in terms of having fundamentally different regulations. There are hardly any examples of where we fundamentally have different regulations. The issue typically has been one of timing, whereby in this particular instance, the United States has been quicker to introduce regulation after the financial crash in Dodd-Frank, and the EU, I think, would agree, has been passing similar legislation, but slightly less quickly. So there's a timing issue, but I don't think there's a substantive difference in the kind of regulation we're passing. So we don't feel it is necessary, and we don't think it should be part of a free trade agreement. The EU disagrees. It continues to raise the issue, but at this point, all I can say is that that is one of the areas that's off the table. By the way, it's not the only one. I think it was mentioned before, audiovisual services is another one where the EU feels very strongly. It's not part of the mandate, it's not being discussed. And there are a number of other difficult areas in these negotiations as well.
And a question from the floor. I see one over here, hand over here. Monsieur in the black jumper.
Good evening. My name is My name is Ljubo Petrigovic. I'm coming from Montenegro. I'm vice mayor of one small town in Montenegro. And in order to show support for what you said tonight, I would take your statement and sign it and use it as my own public statement. The only problem is that we are coming from a candidate country, from a Western Balkans region, very discouraged by the stall announced by the President of the Commission of the enlargement process. And on the other side, we have these statements like the one of Lavrov's that any act of NATO enlargement in Western Balkans region will be regarded as an act of provocation. So what the question is, what would be your words of encouragement for us in the Western Balkan regions that we will not stay in this gray area left out of all these processes, the YPFP and the rest? Thank you.
So just to repeat for those on the webcast, we've had a representative from Montenegro who'd like to know, just to summarize, what words of encouragement the ambassador would have for those in the Western Balkans and acceding member states.
Well, I was just in Montenegro actually recently. It's a beautiful country and I hope to go back. What words of encouragement? Be patient. Look, Juncker, I know that doesn't sound very good, but look, President Juncker has said in his platform there's not going to be any enlargement during the next term of his commission, 5 years. And, well, we can understand why. You know, I'm neither agreeing or disagreeing, but we can understand why. 28 member states is a lot. The EU has to continue to grow together and to continue to be effective. And you see in the blueprint that Juncker has put forward the emphasis on increasing the efficiency of EU decision-making and to contemplate a significant increased enlargement at this point in some people's minds would put at risk the efficiency of EU decision-making. Again, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with that, but that is certainly the EU's view. I would think that if Montenegro satisfies the conditions for membership, it will become a member. And the criteria for membership are set forth very clearly in the Copenhagen criteria. Turkey hasn't satisfied those criteria. If Montenegro does, I suspect it will become a member one day. It's uncertain when, but the words of encouragement would be fulfill the criteria and it will become part of the European family where Montenegro belongs.
And another question from the floor then. I see Havad over there.
I volunteer for YPFP, but in my day job I work for a think tank here in town. And we work a lot on TTIP as well, and also ISDS, so it was interesting that you touched on that in your speech. We are facing a lot of pure opposition, especially even from small, medium-sized enterprises on TTIP because of ISDS, and they feel that somehow the rules disadvantage them. What would be your answer? Is there room for improvement or modernization of ISDS, and how can we do it?
So Havad, who's a representative of think tank, asked about the rules surrounding ISDS for SMEs and whether or not there's opportunity to improve those rules for ISDS for SMEs.
Thanks for that question. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely, yes. I should have mentioned that. Yes, and we are listening. And we have listened to the criticisms, many of which, to be fair, are justified based on the historical record, which is why a number of years ago the United States launched a consultation of its own. Now the EU is doing a similar exercise. And as a result of that consultation, we published our model bilateral investment treaty that in our judgment responds to a lot of those criticisms about how the system did not function properly. For example, it's tightened the rules so that investors can't bring baseless, what we call vexatious claims. They can be thrown out more easily. Our model of bilateral investment treaty has makes it clear that judgments of arbitral tribunals have to be published so that it solves or addresses the issue of lack of transparency. It's addressed the issue of abuse by many investors of setting up shell companies in particular countries to benefit from the protections offered to them under bilateral investment treaties. Our document also makes it clear that governments can, or the U.S. government can issue binding guidelines to arbitral tribunals about how they need to apply certain provisions, particularly the provisions that are most often litigated, for example, fair and equitable treatment. A lot of other ways that we think we have addressed the criticisms. What I would say to the critics is, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Work with us to improve the system. Don't just throw it out. And I would say also two things. There is no way we can sign a TTIP without an ISDS and then expect to sign an agreement with China, for example, that does not include an investor-state dispute settlement. There's no way that would be accepted. What we're trying to do in this agreement is to set a standard for 21st century ambitious trade agreement. So hence, we need it in. And secondly, for those who argue to you or to others in this room, why do we need this mechanism between two advanced economies, between two advanced legal systems? Of course, it's true we're advanced economies and two advanced legal systems, but I can tell you that every week I have in my office quite a few investors, American investors and European investors, by the way, who say the degree of protection in the EU 28 is not identical. It's very variable. And they believe, again, not my judgment, but they believe that they need this mechanism to allow them or to stimulate their investment and their long-term risk capital on which growth and jobs in Europe depend. And I tell my audiences in Europe, you want to relaunch European growth? Well, you should listen to those investors who are telling you that in order for them to commit their capital and their hundreds of billions of euros waiting to be invested today, you should listen to them and perhaps give them a bit of credit when they say they need ISDS to commit capital. Finally, it's a little too easy to say, well, there are a number of instances where we've signed agreements that don't include ISDS, and Brazil has gotten a lot of investment there without ISDS. There are a number of other cases that are cited. China, for example. But, Europe is different. Brazil as an emerging economy has been growing, and China has been growing at very fast rates of growth. Maybe you can argue they didn't need it, but Europe, in the view of many investors, does need it. And I would also finally say, European investors should welcome the opportunity to bring cases before arbitral tribunals and not litigate their cases in U.S. courts and avoid the cost of paying U.S. lawyers, who are very expensive, about $1,000 an hour, and that typically can take a very long time. They should welcome it too. And by the way, EU investors have been the ones who have been most active users. If you just look at the statistics, the historical record, it's the EU investors have been the most active users of ISDS.
Okay, I've got a question. The gentleman just there.
We have a mission of Russia to the EU. Mr. Ambassador, well, it's obvious that the views of Washington and Moscow on the crisis in Ukraine are absolutely different. That's okay, that's understandable. But you mentioned that Russia is responsible for deaths of European citizens in the sky over Ukraine. And just after a couple of days after the tragedy in Odessa, you wrote in an article that there was a pro-Russian mob who was responsible for this tragedy. So in other words, they burned themselves. The investigations of both cases are still underway. What makes you be so sure in your judgment? And second, you mentioned that there are a lot of Russian troops on the Ukrainian territory. Why don't you provide world community with some credible evidence of that, except of course from Jen Psaki's daily statements?
So just to repeat, we've had Mikhail from the Russian mission to the EU, who acknowledged that the differences between Moscow and DC are different on the views on Ukraine, and wanted to know why the US is so sure that Russians have been responsible for what's happened recently in Odessa.
I'm not aware. What article are you referring to? That I wrote about something happening?
There was an article in the website of the US mission. It was on May.
Okay, I'm not aware of anything about Odessa, but on the bigger issue about Russian troops in Ukraine, it's obvious that there's satellite evidence, period. And none of our EU interlocutors even question it, okay? Let's be serious. These are people who don't have Russian insignia on their uniforms. There's been a game that's been played, but the game hasn't fooled anybody, right? Let's be honest about it. First, there were little green men that popped up in various airports. No one really knew where they were from. They were mysterious. They came out from nowhere. And the same game has been played, but we know where they're from, we know who's equipped them, and we know perfectly well who supplied the anti-missile systems that shot down that airplane. We have very detailed information, which we have, of course, shared with our European friends, and they completely share our analysis and our conclusions that the system came from Russia, it went back to Russia. The people who shot it were trained in Russia. We know where it was shot from. We know, of course, where the plane landed. And it's very unfortunate that this has happened. Now, we're not saying that they're Russians who pushed the trigger, but it doesn't matter, because those who fired it were trained, and when you hand an expensive piece of equipment like the surface-to-air missile system that was provided, you bear the responsibility for what happens when it is used, in particular against the backdrop of many other planes that were shot down in the same region by the separatists. Now, no one is claiming that the separatists knew that the plane was a civilian aircraft, but it was reckless negligence, and Russia bears heavy responsibility for that fact. The degree of propaganda that's going on at this moment reminds me of the propaganda I used to see when I was a student in Leningrad. I was there at the Leningrad State University in 1983, pre-Gorbachev. I was living in Russia, then Soviet Union, under Andropov and Chernenko. And what happens today reminds me precisely of the language that was used in 1983, and is a very sad state of affairs, given that we were also hopeful about what would happen during Gorbachev and what Gorbachev represented in terms of perestroika and openness and so forth. So I don't say this with any great, happiness, not at all. I say this with sadness, because we would all like to see Russia as a partner.
Ambassador, thank you. I'm going to take one from Twitter now, and back to TTIP. And from Twitter we have the question, what can we expect in the energy and raw materials chapter of TTIP?
That's still an open question as to whether there is going to be a separate dedicated chapter on energy. We understand the importance of this issue for Europe. And let me just say this, that the exports of gas with free trade agreement partners is quasi-automatic. So by signing a TTIP with the EU, requests for permits for exports of natural gas will be granted quasi-automatically, meaning that you have to make the request, but it will be considered de facto in the national interest of the United States to do so, and it's the Department of Energy that issues those licenses. Now, already it's the case the United States exports, I think it's 96 billion cubic meters of gas per year. That represents, let me get this right, it's, I believe, half of Europe's total imports today of natural gas. So the volumes are already very significant. There are 7 conditionally approved permits being considered by the Department of Energy. And the first one will come on stream at the end of 2015. Now, I say this because you have to remember that the market for natural gas is a world market. So those exports will be to the world market, not for a particular destination. It won't go to Europe specifically. And in fact, the first project that will come on stream in Louisiana has 2 European backers, and they will be selling natural gas where? To Asia, where the costs are, I believe, double double what they are in Europe and triple what they are in the United States. Now, does it mean that it will have no impact on Europe? No, of course not. It will have an indirect impact because there will be more supplies on the world market, and to the extent there are more supplies on the world market, Europe will benefit. And secondly, it sends a very positive message to Russia that Europe, over the longer term, will have an additional source of supply. Again, it's not going to happen immediately. Europe, as we all know, will continue to be dependent to a significant degree on Russian exports of natural gas. But it's an important symbolic statement that U.S. exports will increase. And again, if TTIP is signed, those export permits will be quasi-automatic.
Thank you, Ambassador. One from the floor now. The lady up here has caught my eye.
Well, I can speak now. It's okay. Hi. Well, it's not working here. So. My name is Carolina. I come in from a company in the construction business. Well, one of the main elements of the mandate is to deal with regulatory issues in order to reduce costs and increase trade, right? In Colombia, one of these regulations within the framework of the free trade agreement with the United States imply that all agricultural producers should use only certified seeds in order to produce their crops, which cause an increase in production of the food, a decrease in quality, and ultimately an increase in food prices for the final consumers. My question is it Europe going to be faced with the same kind of regulations in the food industry within the current transatlantic agreement?
So just a question from Carolina, who works in the construction industry here, and obviously talking about the mandate to deal with regulatory issues to reduce costs. And she uses her Colombian background to discuss potential rises in costs based on agricultural markets, and so therefore what the impact of TTIP might be for agriculture in Europe.
Well, a lot of issues are being discussed in the context of the agricultural chapter in terms of sanitary and phytosanitary provisions, but I'm not aware of the particular issue that you are raising in terms of seeds.
Oh yeah, well, in Colombia, after the free trade agreement was signed, the government was forced to pass a bill which was forcing all agricultural producers to only use certified seeds to produce their crops in the whole country, which increased prices, decreased quality, and increased prices of food for final consumers. And I'm worried that maybe Europe is going to be faced with the same kind of regulations in future years.
Well, I'll be completely honest, I've not heard that concern expressed. And you're saying that was the direct consequence of the agreement we signed with Colombia. Well, I'll look into it. I really don't know the answer. If you give me your details, I honestly say I've never heard this concern expressed, including by the European Commission, including by the DG Agriculture.
Okay, I will look out for the
Yeah.
regulation and
Okay.
come back after
Sure.
the-
Thank you very much. I'm going to take one from Twitter now. This comes from @OC_life_travel, that's Orel. And he asks, will TTIP actually help the EU's economic malaise in terms of growth and unemployment?
Yes. But we don't know by how much. We simply don't know, which is, by the way, we have never, in the United States government, the U.S. Trade Representative, we've never espoused, we've never embraced a particular set of projections. Because it's a pretty risky business, right? And we've seen how risky it is when the European Commission puts out these statistics saying that every European family is going to be 565 euros richer, I think is the figure. Or they say that an ambitious deal is going to result in 0.5% increase in GDP. It may be, and it depends on a lot of assumptions, right, about what this deal is going to be. But as I said at the beginning, we're at a very early stage in these negotiations. So it's very difficult to establish the assumptions that will drive those predictions. But again, what we do know, based on the historical record, in the case of the United States, it's NAFTA. It was a net positive in terms of growth and jobs. Were there losers? Of course. Of course they're losers. Anybody who tells you in a free trade agreement there are no losers is lying. But the fact of the matter is a net positive, a significant net positive for the United States. It's also true that NAFTA was not as big a positive as some people were saying at the time. There were a lot of very ambitious projections about what NAFTA would mean for growth and jobs. I think it's fair to say that the reality was less ambitious, but still important for the United States. And the same thing, by the way, I just heard Commissioner de Gucht say the same thing about the Korea EU agreement. Again, early days, but the initial statistics show that it's had a positive impact on growth and jobs, exports from the EU to Korea. So the shorter answer is yes.
Okay, one from the floor. I think we've got one at the front here.
Thank you, Ambassador. Jens Williams, International Trade Consultant. You talked a lot about the EU and the US, but I wondered what do you project the implications of this agreement to be for developing countries? And I wondered in particular reference to, for example, Africa, where you have the economic partnership agreements coming from the EU, and you have AGOA that you currently employ towards Africa. So if we do have a TTIP agreement, what implications would this mean for the future of development policy between the two regions?
So we have Yentel, who's an international trade consultant. She's asking about the implications of TTIP on developing countries like Africa.
I don't think we've done detailed analysis, but we feel that there will be what we call positive spillover effects. It's horrible jargon, but what we mean by that is if we set standards, common standards, there will be positive effects for the rest of the world, because when selling to the EU and the United States, they will face one set of standards and not two, which would reduce costs. First point. And second point, for the emerging countries, I think that there will be very little, I'm not saying none, but very little displacement of trade, because the nature of trade between the emerging countries you're talking about and the US and EU are radically different. One obviously is more on manufactured goods, and the other isn't. So from our perspective, there will be very little displacement, and second, there will be a positive net benefit in terms of selling to one common area with one set of standards.
So we've got a question in from William, who is in the room tonight. Thank you, William. And he asks, and he's done it on social media, how social media can be used as a positive force for economic diplomacy between the US and the EU.
Very important. We're not good enough at doing this. We're trying to get better. We have a great team at the USEU, which is a good start, and I think we're getting better also in Washington, because this is a campaign. It's a political campaign. And we need to use the tools at our disposal to magnify our message, because our opponents are very effectively magnifying our message. And we have to use the same tools, and we have to get our sound bites right. Unfortunately, a lot of this debate is happening in 140 characters or less on Twitter. And I can tell you, it's a real challenge for those of us who are talking about it, especially when you get questions on ISDS. How do you answer it in 140 characters? But we have to find the messages that stick, and we have to find a way to, at least in the Twitter, reference a good document and have it go, well, somewhat viral, right? Because what's particularly different about this debate is that the weight and the influence of the youth, the NGOs, environmental, of labor, is so fundamentally different from the past. Long gone are the days where a bunch of what used to be a lot of white men were sitting around a room striking a trade deal. Now it's, I think, great. It's a good development. Now there are a lot more people involved, and the people directly involved are listening to their constituents. I can tell you, even in the European Parliament, people are listening to their constituents. They're getting letters. They're seeing the tweets. So we have to do a much better job using Facebook and Twitter and all those other media, and that's exactly what we're trying to do.
And well done to the team from the US mission doing that tonight. Ambassador, I'm going to round up tonight's really dynamic discussion with a slight change of theme, and it's a traditional question for YPFP, but one I love to ask. And at YPFP, we're keen to build the next generation of foreign policy leaders. So I'd love to hear your personal recommendations for building a career in foreign policy based on your own extensive foreign service career.
Well, I don't think I'm a model for anything because all I was guided by was my interest in the EU, and my career was a pretty zigzag career. And I think I mentioned at the beginning, it was a pretty weird choice for a US trained lawyer to start law practice in Brussels in 1990. I went around asking for advice at that time. I'd finished law school, I was here, and I figured, well, now what do? I've got to get a real job. I went around and I asked advice, and people said, you go back to New York and you do the traditional thing. You work at a big Wall Street firm, you make a lot of money, and you live happily ever after. And I said, well, that's not really what I want to do, because it's a really interesting place to be here, now. Single market, opening to the East, a lot was happening. It felt like the Washington, D.C. of the future in Europe. And I said, this is where I want to be. I'm also a European. I felt it was the time to be here. And I feel the same sense of excitement today, despite all of the, the skepticism and the anger following the financial crisis, and the skepticism, and we feel in TTIP, in this TTIP debate, by the way, skepticism about any project that is espoused by governments or by Brussels. Despite all that skepticism and the fear and fatigue, this is an interesting time to be here. Part of it is, I put up this cartoon. Part of it is because of that, we have an opportunity to rediscover what it is that we're doing together. And I can tell you, I can't think of a more interesting time in the 23 years that I've been involved in USEU relations. There has never been a more interesting time, full of more potential for us to work together. And I wish I had time to talk about what we're doing for development aid, what we're doing in the Middle East, humanitarian aid as well. What we're doing, for example, in cracking down on online child pornography together, by the way, in terms of our law enforcement agents. A vast number of areas. This is an exciting time to be here. So to answer your question, follow your heart, follow your interests, and let it take you where it does. But if you have passion for what you're doing, I think you'll end up having a happy and fulfilling career.
Fantastic advice. Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I love that comes from someone who truly embodies a transatlantic spirit, I think we've heard tonight. Thank you very much to all of you who joined tonight, and those of you who joined online. We really appreciated you being involved. I'd also like to encourage you to check out the commentary afterwards on Twitter using the hashtag YPFP USEU. Through our programming events, socials and benefits, we want to bring all of you together to be the next foreign policy leaders of the future, and I hope recommendations tonight will help you do that. If you aren't yet a member of YPFP or want to learn more, please feel free to approach myself or another member of staff in the room tonight to discuss more about YPFP. A very quick note on some of our upcoming events. From next Tuesday, we're going to be engaging online with the Security and Defence Agenda's Online Security Jam. It's an interactive online policy debate with VIP stakeholders from all over the world. Really excitingly, YPFP is going to host its own chat on Wednesday at 11 p.m. Brussels time, so it'll be a bit of a late one, to discuss what skills, knowledge and networks the foreign policy leaders of 2030 need. So please join us for that. And on the 20th of October, we're going to be hosted by Carnegie for a discussion on whether or not drones can help keep Iraq and Syria safe from the threat of ISIL. The announcement on that will be coming up this week, so please keep your eyes out. And finally, a bit of a teaser, YPFP is going to have its inaugural and very first gala event. So details will be coming on that. Keep your eyes posted. Thank you so much to my staff who've helped out tonight. Thank you so much to the US mission staff who've put in an incredible amount of time to support us and to make the live stream happen, which is a new thing for YPFP and absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And finally, Ambassador, thank you so much for your time tonight. Thank you very much.